Good morning, church. I pray that you are setting your eyes and focusing on God. And in light of yesterday's devotion, I pray that you are fixing your eyes in the direction that you want to go. So with that, let's go ahead and begin. Salt. Yes, salt. S-A-L-T. When we think of salt, we first of all think of food, right? And salt is a really important part of the food that we eat, right? Bland food doesn't really taste good, and we don't really enjoy eating things that are bland. So salt is used to add flavor. Other than salt being used to flavor food, or in my case, over flavoring the food with too much salt, what else is salt good for? Well, I'm glad you asked. Salt is used also as a way to preserve food, right? But also it's used in like tanning, it's used in bleaching, it's used in sometimes things like soap for the production of soap and many other different chemicals that we may use. Salt actually is also used in medical fields as a way to prevent infections. But in colder climate, weathers and countries and cities, ice or salt is also used to melt ice, right? And we don't use that here in California, so you probably don't even know what I'm talking about. But also, salt is used as a way to fix things, right? So for example, if you have watermarks on like wood or anything like that, you can use a mix of salt and water as a paste, and you can remove those watermarks. You're welcome. Or in biblical times, if we talk about the use of salt, salt was used in different sacrifices. They would salt the sacrifice, or sometimes they would use it as a form of currency. In biblical times, people used this as a way of paying for things. But also, salt was used as a way to signify friendship or a relationship with somebody. So you would meet up with your best friend for life and you would eat salt with them, and that represented your best friend forever kind of thing. Or in another way that salt is used, Ezekiel 16 gives us a hint that they would use salt on newborn babies. They would rub the salt on them. That's a totally different topic. So if you really want to know why they did that, you can ask me and I'll tell you why. Now, anyways, salt has many uses, but also in the modern day, we use salt as a way to describe people. You can call someone salty, right? Hey, you're a salty guy, or hey, don't be salty. Like, bro, you're so salty. So what does that mean? Basically, this slang means that if you're salty, then you're somebody that is upset over maybe like small, like little things in life. In modern day terminology, being salty is not really a good thing. But I want to challenge you, as Christians, the Bible actually calls us to be salty. Now, what does it mean to be salty in the biblical sense? Now, Paul, as he wraps up his letter to Colossians, he leaves them with these final instructions, but specifically he's talking to this church about how they interact with outsiders or with non-believers. And he calls them to make the best of the opportunities they have to share with them the gospel message. But specifically and very briefly, he mentions how they should conduct their conversations with these people. Look at Colossians 4 verse 6. It says, "Let your conversations be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone." Now, Paul says that there are two things that their conversation should be filled with. One, should be full of grace, and two, it should be seasoned with salt. Now, the first part I think is pretty straightforward, right? To be filled with grace means to be filled with the grace that God has extended to us. And then when we speak to people, we should be talking about this wonderful grace that we have received. But it also means that when we speak to these people about this grace, we should do it in a loving way, in a graceful way, right? Especially to those that don't know Jesus, we should introduce Jesus as this wonderful blessing in our lives. But the second part, where Paul says to be seasoned with salt, what does that even mean? How do you salt a conversation, right? Do you print it out? Do you write it down? Do you take your phone and then throw salt on it? Like, no, absolutely not. That makes no sense. But you see, this is what Paul is talking about when he says that we should season our conversations with salt. Think about what salt does, first of all. Salt brings flavor, and it also preserves. So in a quite literal sense, when Paul says our conversation should be seasoned with salt, our conversations to those that don't know Jesus, and really to anyone in general, it should be delicious, it should be tasty, it should be exciting, it should be the opposite of bland. It should be appealing to people. In other words, Paul wants us to talk to unbelievers in a manner that will satisfy their spiritual appetites. You see, Jesus also uses the imagery of salt, and he describes the disciples as witnesses to the world by using this description of salt, right? Matthew 5:13 says, "You are the salt of the earth." And he says this because he wants the disciples to go and to fill this world that's filled with sin in this rotten world. And he wants them to be salt, to preserve it, to bring flavor to the things that need flavor, right? He wants us to preserve the world, which is the goodness of God, the gospel, the message. That's what the salt is, the salt that has flavor. So in the same way, Paul is using this analogy because he wants us to talk with the purpose of preserving and leading people to God's amazing grace. So in other words, in short, I think the Bible is very clear when it calls us to be salty. It's a call for us to engage in mission. It's a call for us to engage in going around giving this bland, sinful world the flavorful gospel and the goodness and love of God that it desperately needs. And the reason why we should do this, it's really clear. According to Paul, he says that we should have these conversations so that we can have the answers for everyone. And that's a part of the Christian walk, right? It's not just about my own relationship between me and God. It's not just vertical. It's horizontal as well. It's between not just me and him, it's about me and others. It's about sharing this experience of God's grace and his mercy and his love. So church, remember this. Be filled with God's grace and be salty. Go flavor the bland world with God's love, mercy, and grace.